brothers and sisters. You're tuned into another episode of the Gospel of Malcolm X podcast. I am your host, Brother Eric. As always, it is my pleasure to be back and in the studio with you once again. I'd like to take the time out, as I always do, to give a special shout out to all of the brothers and sisters out there that show your love and support to the Gospel of Malcolm X podcast. It is truly appreciated. So happy New Year to all of you guys. Thank you for coming back with me in the new year. I know it's been a while since I've done an episode, and tonight's episode I'm thinking is going to be kind of short. Just want to make a few quick points on an interesting, more spiritual subject for the Gospel of Malcolm X podcast this year to bring in the new year. And also some good news is that we're going to be moving some more of the episodes over to the YouTube as well. So I'm going to kind of figure out a channel name or so. But those of you that's already following me on YouTube, you'll start to see some of the episodes there. So that'll be yet another platform where you guys can listen to the material, share the material, follow up on research with the material, etc. And just to expose the Gospel of Malcolm X to a larger audience. I have been purposely avoiding YouTube for some time, but I think this year you're going to see more content on the platform. Maybe not every episode, but a lot more content on the YouTube platform. And this will probably be one of the episodes that goes there. So my topic today, and it's fitting that it is a Sunday, is going to be Jesus, Malcolm X, and the Essenes. And this is a very good topic because a lot of people don't know about the historical first century community called the Essenes. A lot of people have been in church all their lives and don't know about Jesus' affiliation with the Essenes. And even with the internet, a lot of people don't know. And this information is more available now than ever before with the invention of the internet. But there was a great thinker back in the 1950s and 60s named Malcolm X, who was aware of Jesus's connection to the Essenes. And he wrote about it in his book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X. So I want to share that information here that, Malcolm X was spiritually in tune. He was not only just a political leader, but he had true spiritual discernment, in my opinion, on every topic except Elijah Muhammad. That was Elijah, and he even cracked that coconut towards the end of his life. But while he was in his prime, of course, Elijah Muhammad, that he had a weakness. That was his blind spot. And even some of the leadership there, he just loved Elijah Muhammad and he loved the Nation of Islam. But once his eyes were open, they were open. But for this man to know this information, that, like I said, there's a lot of people that's been in church all of their lives and don't understand the spiritual significance of a community like the Essenes and what they meant for the followers of Christ and for ushering in that energy, the true spirituality, the true freedom movement, peace movement, etc. I think that has to be understood. So I'm going to be reading from the Autobiography of Malcolm X. In my version, I'm reading the online version. It is on page 190. And I'm actually going to read further than the part where he just talks about the Essenes, because in the last episode I did in November, I talked about when he had the issue with Kennedy, right? So that was in the last episode that I did in November. And so he actually talks about that right after this passage. So I want to follow up with that because we get to hear more of Malcolm talking about it in his own words. So he says, non-Muslims who knew me well, and even some of the white reporters with whom I had regular contact with, were telling me wherever I went, Malcolm X, you look tired, you need rest. They didn't know a fraction of it. Since I had been a Muslim, this was the first time any white people really got to me in a personal way. I could tell that some of them were really honest and sincere. One of these, whose name I won't call, he might lose his job, said, "Malcolm X, the whites need your voice worse than the Negroes." I remember so well his saying this because it prefaced the first time since I became a Muslim that I had ever talked with any white man at any length about anything except the Nation of Islam and the American black man struggle today. I can't remember how or why he somehow happened to mention the Dead Sea Scrolls. I came back with something like, yes, those scrolls are going to take Jesus off the stained glass windows and the frescoes where he has been lily white and put him back into the true mainstream of history, where Jesus actually was non-white. The reporter was surprised, and I went on that the Dead Sea Scrolls were going to reaffirm that Jesus was a member of the Brotherhood of Egyptian seers called the Essenes, a fact already known from Philo, the famous Egyptian historian of Jesus' time. And the reporter and I got off on about 2 good hours of talking in the areas of archaeology, history, and religion. It was so pleasant, I almost forgot the heavy worries on my mind for that brief respite. I remember we wound up agreeing that by the year 2000, every school child will be taught the true color of great men of antiquity. So that hasn't happened. But the information is more available now. And yes, the Essenes also had a strong connection to Egypt. And Yeshua is said to have also learned and studied in Egypt. And you see from his birth, from that time, he traveled into Egypt, which is very fitting. And it seems like he brought that information back and used it to teach. So that is basically the body of our subject today in terms of Malcolm's understanding of the one called Jesus, or Yeshua, in this way of being a non-white person, a person with Egyptian connections and a part of an Egyptian brotherhood called the Essenes. And we're going to learn about the other groups that existed during that time and why the Essenes was a group that was completely set apart. And so Malcolm is now about to go on, and because when he's saying that there's so much on his mind, this is right at the time of the Kennedy stuff. And this is why he talked about looking so stressed and so tired, etc. He says, I've said that I expected headlines momentarily. I hadn't expected the kind which came. No one needs to be reminded of who got assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. Within hours after the assassination, I'm telling nothing but the truth. Every Muslim minister from Mr. Elijah Muhammad received from Mr. Elijah Muhammad two directives. Every minister was ordered to make no remarks at all concerning the assassination. Mr. Muhammad instructed that if pressed for a comment, we should say no comment. So why is this important here? Malcolm also mentioned in a previous, I believe this was in the in the presser that he did, is that basically when this Kennedy assassination happened, that Elijah Muhammad was completely shook. He was completely shaken, and he had never seen a human being as afraid as Elijah Muhammad was at that particular time. And so this is why Elijah Muhammad is sending these orders down. Now, there was a guy named H.L. Hunt who was big in the oil industry and was a big player in Dallas. And so pretty much the top guys, I guess, assumed or had some hint that what went down with Kennedy, since it happened in Dallas, may have been connected to H.L. Hunt. And Elijah wasn't taking any chances with this information, and that may have been why he was so shook. During that 3-day period where there was no other news to be heard except relating to the murdered president, Mr. Muhammad had a previously scheduled engagement in New York at the Manhattan Center. He canceled his coming to speak as we were unable to get the back money already paid for the rental of the center. Mr. Muhammad told me to speak in his stead, and so I spoke. So at this time, Elijah Muhammad's supposed to speak in Manhattan. He counsels the speech. He ain't want to do no public speaking at that time. He let Malcolm speak in his stead. Many times since then, I've looked at the speech notes I used that day, which had been prepared at least a week before the assassination. The title of my speech was the title of my speech was, quote, God's Judgment of White America. It was on the theme familiar to me of as you sow, so shall you reap, or how the hypocritical white man was reaping what he had sowed. The question and answer period opened, I suppose inevitably, with someone asking, what do you think about President Kennedy's assassination? What's your opinion? Without a second thought, I said what I honestly felt, and it was as I saw it, a case of the chickens coming home to roost. I said that the hate in white men had not stopped with the killing of defenseless black people, but that hate allowed to spread unchecked finally had struck down this country's chief of state. I said that it was the same thing that had happened with Medgar Evers, with Patrice Lumumba, and with Madame Newell's husband. The headlines and the news broadcast promptly had it, Black Muslims, Malcolm X, chickens come home to roost. It makes me feel worried to think of it all now. All over America, all over the world, some of the world's most important personages were saying in various ways and in a far stronger ways than I did that America's climate of hate had been responsible for the president's death. But when Malcolm X said the same thing, it was ominous. My regular monthly visit to Mr. Muhammad was due the next day. Somehow on the plane, I expected something. I've always had strong intuition. Mr. Muhammad and I embraced each other in greeting. I sensed some ingredient missing from his usual amiability, and I was suddenly tense. To me, also very significant. For years, I had prided myself that Mr. Muhammad and I were so close that I knew how he felt by how I felt. If he was nervous, I was nervous. If I was relaxed, then I knew he was relaxed. Now I felt the tension. First, we talked of other things, sitting in his living room. Then he asked me, I got to do my Elijah Muhammad impression. Did you see the papers this morning, Malcolm? I said, yes, sir. This was a very bad statement. He said, the country loved this man. The country is in mourning. This is very ill-timed. A statement like that can make it very hard for Muslims in general. And then, as if Mr. Muhammad's voice came from afar, I heard the words, I will have to silence you for the next 90 days so that Muslims everywhere can be disassociated from the blunder. I was numb, but I was a follower of Mr. Muhammad. Many times I had said to my own assistants that anyone in a position to discipline others must be able to take disciplining himself. I told Mr. Muhammad, sir, I agree with you and I submit 100%. I flew back to New York, psychologically preparing myself to tell my Mars 7 assistants that I had been suspended or silenced. But to my astonishment, upon my arrival, I learned that my assistants had already been informed. What astonished me even more, a telegram had been sent to every New York City newspaper and radio and television statement. It was the most quick and thorough publicity job that I have ever seen the Chicago officials initiate. Every telephone where I could possibly be reached was ringing. London, Paris, AP, UPI, every television and radio network, and all of the newspapers were calling. I told them all, quote, I disobeyed Mr. Muhammad. I submit completely to his wisdom. Yes, I expect to be speaking again after 90 days. Malcolm X silenced. It was headlines. My first worry was if the scandal broke for the Nation of Islam within the next 90 days, I would be gagged and I could not be the most experienced Muslim in dealing with the news media that would make the most of any scandal with the Nation of Islam. And of course, you guys already know what that scandal was. So that is pretty much that in terms of how that went. My last episode was on November 22nd, covering it for the anniversary. So I felt that it was good to let Malcolm tell a story in his own words. And of course, I strongly advise all of you guys to read the autobiography of Malcolm X for yourself. So I'm going to bounce back into my Jesus and the Essene topic, and I'm going to finish up there. So my next article is called 4 Views of Judaism. It was written by Ray Vander Laan on a website called That the World May Know, and it's Movements of Jesus Day. 4 views of Judaism. In Jesus' day, there were varying philosophies within the Jewish faith. While some Jews embraced the Roman rulers, others resisted with violence. And whereas some Jewish believers lived a simple, isolated lifestyle, others enjoyed a lifestyle of wealth and influence. 4 predominant religious groups emerged: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Now, 3 of these groups are pretty much mentioned in the New Testament, and you guys who have studied the New Testament may be familiar with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Zealots. Some of Jesus' homeboys, mainly the one that comes to mind is Peter, was known to be associated with this group that was referred to as Zealots, more of like a revolutionary anti-Roman force that was connected to Jesus. This is why they had problems with the tax collectors and that whole class, and they were asking Yeshua about the taxes. And of course, he gives them the statement. He actually asked for a coin. And I always find it interesting that he asked for a Roman coin. He asked for one, meaning this wasn't something that he was carrying around with him, or most likely this is not something that he was carrying around with him. This Roman coin, not something that he was using. You know, in his miracles, he wasn't talking about money or whatever. He just fed people, etc. So he had to actually ask someone for a Roman coin. And then he told them to render unto Caesar was due unto Caesar, and to render unto God was due unto God, or render unto me was due unto me, right? Something like that. I'm not quoting the exact scripture, but basically render unto Caesar was due unto Caesar, render unto God was due unto God. Some variation of that. And at least in the churches that I grew up in, that was always looked at in a way to say, hey, pay your taxes because that's Caesar's, so pay your taxes. But the way that I'm looking at it is this money is Caesar's money. So that's the money that's doing, like, I'm not even carrying this around with me. You know, like, that's Caesar's money. His head is the one that's on the coin. You know, and he answered the question with wisdom. And you have to remember that at this time, religious movements weren't necessarily something that was viewed as a threat in Rome. I'm not going to say they had 100% religious freedom, but it wasn't something that was viewed as a threat, as long as you paid your taxes and you weren't going against the Roman state. Remember, the political idea of someone saying not to pay taxes, or someone even suggesting that, would be a lot more dangerous. And when you talk about something like a crucifixion, we're talking about something that is a Roman form of execution. And it's not something done for religious ideas. This is something that is a political statement. So he talks about the 4 groups of religious, the 4 predominant religious groups: the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. During his ministry, Jesus likely interacted with all of them, touching the hearts of some, sparking violent hatred among others. First group, Pharisees, origins, descended from the Hasidim freedom fighters of the Maccabee era. Membership, middle-class merchants numbering about 6,000. Beliefs, believed in the entire Old Testament as law. Accepted oral interpretation of the Old Testament. Believed study of Torah was the highest act of worship. God's desire was for people to keep the law. Believed that bodily resurrection believed that bodily resurrection, believed in bodily resurrection and life after death. Their practices supported the synagogues for Torah study and interpretation, strict, detailed obedience to oral and written law, and accepted Rome as a necessary evil as long as they were allowed to practice their beliefs. And of course, you see all the time Yeshua arguing back and forth with the Pharisees and the Sadducees as basically opponents that were asking him all types of tricky questions, trying to get him caught up with the Roman authorities. Basically, the Pharisees and the Sadducees remind you of like the Nation of Islam and their plot against Malcolm X. That they were the Jewish class that saw Jesus as, I guess, a revolutionary force that was a threat to their cult, because this was their cult that they had. So in that scene where you see Jesus going into the temple and flipping over the money tables, you see this is what Malcolm did when he exposed the Nation of Islam. He was threatening their money and flipping over their money tables, because at this time, in Yeshua's time, when he flipped it over during Passover, they were exchanging money for these like animals and sacrifices and trinkets. And he said, you turned my father's house into a den of thieves, right? And so Malcolm, in some ways, carried on a lot of that revolutionary rhetoric, and he went against these sects of this day that was profiting off of a religious cult, which is what the Pharisees and the Sadducees were doing. And just like the Pharisees believed in the Old Testament and this law and that law, of course, you had your Nation of Islam people that were talking about the lessons and etc. So the third group of people that he mentions are the Essenes. Essenes, origins, registered Maccabees, claimed to high priest in approximately 170 AD. Possibly descendant of Sadducees or Pharisees, preferred isolation in the wilderness to participation in temple services led by corrupt priests. Beliefs: they need to be withdrawn from corruption. Believed true priests descended only from Zadok. Believed, I'm probably saying that name wrong. So to the Jewish homies, if I'm saying that name, Zadok, wrong, I apologize. Believed in the rigid adherence to the Torah. Believed that they had been chosen to prepare for an imminent arrival of the kingdom of God. Practices: worked at copying and studying Torah. Lived in isolated communities. Shared property and communal meals. Practiced ritual cleansings. And so this is why we said copying Torah and books and all of that. This is kind of what Malcolm was referring to when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is how he said that now you're going to see that Jesus was connected to that group called the Essenes. Fourth group, Zealots. Origin: a movement formed against Rome, against a Roman census in 6 AD. So 6 years around the time that they say Yeshua was born. I'm not a mythicist, and let me say I'm very much against mythicism. For y'all who don't know what it is, mythicism is a common idea it's in the white community, but I see it prevalent in the black community, where they try to say that this person, Yeshua, did not exist. I'm very much against mythicism. I don't have any problem with someone necessarily questioning a story or asking questions or, looking at things logically or whatever. So if you don't believe that this person was necessarily born at this time, or you have a question about this, a question about this fact, I never have a problem with it. But to say that someone didn't exist because they weren't recorded in someone else's history books, etc., I think it's just unfair. There's just too many stories and too much on this subject for there not to be for this to be completely myth and there not to be some kernel of truth here. So I have no problem with anybody questioning anything, but I think mythicism is downright in some ways satanic, and a lot of people that get into that mythicism information, not release, mythicism point of view to attack Yeshua or to attack religion and say, hey, none of this existed. you'll see that a lot of that information was brought up by people that were Luciferians, etc. A lot of that information is connected to Luciferianism, and we all know that's not taking you anywhere where it could. So the beliefs of the zealot, it says their theology resembled that of the Pharisees. However, they believed only God could rule. Slavery was the worst evil. Taxes were due to only God. Hated the rule of Romans. And it says they practiced terrorism against the Romans, refused to pay taxes, adhered carefully to Torah interpretation. So this word terrorism against the Romans is something that I'm going to reflect on, because we see it being used a lot loosely with this Hamas, aka the Palestinians, Israel conflict, where all of the Palestinians are being referred to as basically terrorists, and really they're the ones being terrorized, but the Hamas and the Palestinians get referred to as terrorists more than anything else, despite the fact that over 30,000 of their people have been killed. And what happened on October 7th, of course, is something that you wouldn't want to see happen to any group of people. But now they've killed over 30 times more Palestinians than what was killed on October 7th, and it's still not enough. And the thirst for blood is still whatever, but they will label them as terrorists. And this is interesting because it says they practiced terrorism against the Romans, when really it was the Romans that were terrorizing them and crucifying tons and tons of Jews. And so when you talk about something that's like a crucifixion, you can't get any more terroristic than that. So there's an old saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So I'm going to conclude today's podcast with a clip from a former CIA spy who spoke on the Israel-Hamas conflict, and he unpacked it in a very useful way. Now, he said that he's pro-Israel, and his reasons for being pro-Israel was for basically the security of America and for America to maintain its dominance as a world power, that Israel must be a world power in that region. However, he's not pro-Israel to the point where he's anti-Palestinian, and he believes in a two-state solution, which I think we're actually going. There's been more people saying that a two-state solution, that America is going to be the one that is going to force that to be the case. But he refers to Malcolm X in a small segment here, and he actually uses the word terrorism in Malcolm X in this small segment. And so I think that's why it's really good to listen to this, because he unpacks it very well, and even though he said that he had never revealed that his position was pro-Israel, and actually the person that was interviewing him said that actually accused him of being pro-Palestinian, but he said, no, I just don't reveal what my outlook is. And he was basically saying that the Palestinians are suffering from an injustice, and so in order to achieve any goals here, what we must first do is end that injustice. So I think it was very interesting. It was very nuanced. I'll let him play the clip. I'll let him talk through it, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Ideology aside, if we want to protect American lives, we have to ensure the long-term longevity, support, and close relationships with the Israeli people and with the country of Israel. That is my official position. What I find is so sad is that there are so few pro-Israel voices that are giving any kind of validation to the Palestinian plight. So I want to be one of those voices that can say, we must partner and support Israel. And the way that we partner and support them is by finding a way for them to protect and defend themselves without turning to this kind of destruction. Because as long as they turn down this path of destruction, they're isolating themselves from everyone else in the world. And that makes it so that we have a very hard time standing next to them as the beacon of freedom in the world. We have a hard time supporting Israel in the face of everybody else, including all the countries of the United Nations and NATO, who look at us and say, how can you stand by and let this happen? How can you support this? How can you fund this? How can you encourage this? Not to mention the corruption challenges that Israel has that's so closely aligned with the corruption challenges of our own past presidential, hopefuls and presidents that we're trying to work through ourselves, between Netanyahu's corruption and Trump's corruption, right? It's a mess, and it's a sad mess. But the bottom line practical element here is that Israel encourages and expands national security objectives for the United States. That doesn't mean we should call Hamas terrorists just because we don't want to call them revolutionary terrorists, which is really more akin to what Malcolm X was, revolutionary terrorism, right? We don't want to go down that road because it's too nuanced for the American people. Instead, we're going to put big billboards up in major cities that say, Hamas is not just Israel's problem, right? Hamas is your problem too. So I say all that because my conclusion is the same as your conclusion. The world, the globe, needs to broker a two-state solution. And in order to incentivize that two-state solution, we need to rally and give the Palestinians that economic boost that the Israelis got post-World War II. Let's find a way to massively expedite their infrastructure, their technology, their ability to self-govern. Let's give them everything they need. If that means that they want to
paying your bills on.
Okay, so that pretty much, that pretty much summarizes that. I thought that was very interesting. I found it very interesting that he brought Malcolm X up there as well, and seen him as a strong voice for a people that were facing injustice. And he kind of compared what's happening in Palestine now sort of to what was happening with black people during the civil rights movement. Of course, it didn't quite go as far as this, but there have been times where I wanted to do a special on the movement. There have been times where there were bombs and things like that used, nothing to this capacity that we're seeing right now in Palestine. But I think it's very interesting if someone of that caliber is bringing up Malcolm X's name as a revolutionary force. And I always say that Malcolm X is cut from a different cloth. This is the difference between somebody like a Malcolm X and somebody like, say, like an Elijah Muhammad, who was out for Dolo. He was basically on the Luciferian side. This is why he was sending those Masonic hints. You'll notice that a lot of times, go back and watch Elijah Muhammad and the hats that he wore. Back in the 50s and stuff, you would see that he had the pentagram on his hats. It was an upright pentagram. Right around the time he started having these conflicts with Malcolm and speaking out against Malcolm and that whole nine, you'll notice that the pentagram was an inverted pentagram, which is, of course, as we know, a satanic symbol. And basically the upright pentagram represents God, with the singular point being upright, like a man, like a human being, with the 5 points, 2 arms, a leg, and the head. The inverted pentagram is the exact opposite, with the head, the profane, the spirit. The head represents the spirit. So basically, when you have an inverted pentagram, that puts the spirit down at the bottom and puts the material world up at the top. And we see with people like Yeshua, who, like I said, he had to ask for a coin. He wasn't overly concerned with material possessions. He wasn't carrying around tons of Roman coins. We know that leaders like Malcolm X and a lot of the Black Panthers, these weren't people that were overly materially rich. Their wealth, or in the way that Yeshua said, their kingdom was not of this world. And so I don't have the scripture in front of me. I should read it. I want to read this scripture for the sake of accuracy here. When the devil tried to tempt Jesus in the wilderness. All right, so it says Matthew 4:1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered, for it is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world with their splendor. And he says, all this I will give you. So that tells you right now who owns all of the kingdoms of the world. It says the devil took him to the very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And the devil said, all of this I will give you. So if it's the devil that will give it to him, that tells you right there who owns the kingdoms of the world. This is Matthew 4 and 8. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And this I will give you, he said, if you bow down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and the angels came and attended him. Now there, Cat Williams has been on, he's been trending all week for what he's been talking about with celebrities, there's Illuminati parties, the P. Diddy's and the T.D. Jakes of the world, etc. There are celebrities that get this offer right here from the devil, and they bow down and worship him when he offers them all of the kingdoms of the world. And so I think that this is a very significant point where you've seen that somebody like Yeshua rejected it. Somebody like Malcolm rejected it. Malcolm also was known to fast and live in the spirit of discipline. And so that's why I give Malcolm the respect I do, not just for his political acumen, but for his spiritual acumen and his, I see him as a messianic figure of biblical proportions. I feel like that him in the 60s was somebody of biblical proportions. And that's why even in the FBI documents, he was referred to as a black messiah. Elijah Muhammad was also seen as someone with that potential, but they said because of his age. And then also by 1968, they didn't see him as a threat completely at all anymore. But they really knew before then that he was corrupted. They really knew before then, but Elijah Muhammad is a very interesting guy to follow around. So they kept the surveillance on him. But they knew before then. But Malcolm X was seen as a black messianic figure. And I think they named two other people as well. But this was the chief name. Malcolm X was the chief name. And this was said this was said about him even after he had already left and by the FBI themselves. And he wasn't even alive at the time. So I think that is very significant. The other thing I want to mention, and then I'll close out, is that the significance of the baptism of Yeshua right before this story. Because basically what happens is when he gets baptized and then goes out to the mountains. As a matter of fact, I'll read this caption of it. It says, the baptism of Jesus. Jesus came from Galilee to Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, I need to baptize you, and do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this and to fulfill all righteousness. Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. So this is, people always say that, Yeshua was born as God. Something happened at this baptism because he went through this ritual, this cleansing ritual, which John baptized him. And it says as soon as Jesus was baptized and he went up from the water, at that moment, heaven was open. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my son whom I love and with whom I'm well pleased. So that baptism was a significant point. And then he faced the temptation and the challenges that he went on with his fasting. So there was an initiation process. into his becoming the great person who he became. And so, that is all I have for today. I thank you so much for listening, brothers and sisters. I hope that you guys take the time to study more about the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls and a lot of their works and their community. Learn about Philo and Pythagoras, and all of those connections with the Essene community, because it's something that we are not taught about in church. And a lot of the material, or in the mosque, or whatever your religious belief is, a lot of material and a lot of things were removed from the Bible for y'all purposes. I just read from the traditional book, so this is in your Bible. If you want to go and read what I was reading today, I even called the scriptures. This one right here was from Matthew 3. This was the baptism, and the other one was from Matthew 4. So yes, thank you so much for listening, brothers and sisters. As always, I appreciate your love and support. For my YouTube listeners, feel free to leave me a comment, show me some love. Always feel free to hit me in my inbox or so, and just hit me up and give me show ideas, show love, whatever. So until the next episode, rather, of the Gospel of Malcolm X podcast, peace and love.